coming into the fight, the questions were, is Dominick Reyes good enough to challenge Jon Jones? Is Jon Jones declining? Is he, questions about Jon and everything. What's your takeaway from this fight? Did we see Jon Jones declining, or is this a case of Reyes is better? What was your takeaway when you got finished watching that fight?
Well, my takeaway is that Jon Jones has always been at the top of the division because he was so much better at doing everything than anybody else. This was a specialist division. Look at who he beat. He beat Rampage. He beat Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans to an extent, although I think Rashad Evans was somewhat well-rounded. Those were fighters that were from a previous generation. Even the Vitor Belforts, Chael Sonnens of the world, the guys that he's beaten are that's a previous generation of fighter. This is only the second time that Jon Jones has fought somebody younger than him in his entire MMA career. So when you look at it that way, you have to remember that the game is catching up. Everybody at light heavyweight that's like a Dominick Reyes, that's newer to the division, newer to the sport, they're all training every day to fight Jon Jones. Whereas Jon Jones was fighting to beat all these other guys that were one-dimensional guys. So I just think that the division is starting to just catch up with Jon Jones. I still think that Jon Jones is the greatest of all time. But I think that when you look at this particular division, you're seeing a lot more well-rounded fighters. I thought that Reyes, if you would listen to my podcast 2 weeks ago, we do our picks based on, I guess, the lines. And I picked Dominick Reyes. I thought that Dominick Reyes at plus 340, 350 was a good line in terms of value. And I think that while he did lose, and, losing is always the wrong side, I do think that I had a good point, and that a lot of the points that myself and Robin Black also brought up when we were talking about can Reyes beat Jones, a lot of the things that we said would be crucial to him beating Jones happened in that fight. A lot of good combos, a lot of good footwork, always moving, not, those kind of skills, the leg kicks, all of those things kind of translated and gave Jon Jones difficulty. So my takeaway is that Jon Jones should stay at light heavyweight for the foreseeable future. I want to see him get challenged by guys like Reyes. I think Corey Anderson, another very well-rounded fighter, we'll see if he gets the job done this weekend. But I think that the division is starting to catch up with Jon Jones. I don't think Jon Jones is getting worse. I just think everybody else is getting better.
My first takeaway after the fight, it reminded me a little bit of LeBron James, where people talk about LeBron and they're saying he's not in his prime anymore. And yet LeBron not being in his prime is still that much better than everybody else. And I think that kind of applies for Jon Jones as well. I don't feel like he's quite in his prime anymore. And yet he's still that much better than everybody else. The biggest takeaway for me is not so much Jon Jones' decline, although I feel like he's declining a little bit. For me, this was just how good Dominick Reyes looked out there. I mean, just from the opening couple of seconds, you saw he really put the pressure on Jon, and Jon's face kind of told you that he was surprised at the pressure. So I feel like Dominick Reyes came in there with a really good game plan. I think, you mentioned that he's younger than him. He had like I said, a very good game plan, but he also matched up really well for someone trying to beat Jon Jones. I mean, we've seen him struggle with guys that can match that height. I mean, OSP, and you look at it and you're like, come on, OSP, but 6'4", and Jon Jones didn't give us a great performance. Alexander Gustafsson, 6'5", Dominick Reyes goes out there 6'4". So physically, he had the gifts to sort of give Jon Jones a challenge. But for me, his team, they really did this great job of putting it on Jon Jones, and we saw it pay dividends in the opening rounds. Judges aside and everything, I think he came out there with a really good game plan. Physically, I'd say he's in the prime of his life. And I know the joke coming in on his athleticism was like, oh, the baseball player and all that stuff. But I think we did see some athleticism, and he looked really good out there. So my takeaway is, man, Dominick Reyes looked really great, but I think Jon Jones is regressing just a little bit.
Yeah, I think you can make that conclusion based on the last three fights that Jones has had. They just haven't been impressive. Whether or not that means he's regressing or the rest of the division's getting better, or he's just not getting up for these fights as much as he used to, it's really anyone's guess. But the creativity that we've seen from Jon Jones over the year, I don't think was on display in this fight. I think that he was just working to his strengths. I think that he was doing the things that he needed to do to stay in the fight, and ultimately ended up winning the fight on the scorecards. Now, I didn't agree with the scorecards, but I do think that it was a very close fight. Certainly not a robbery by any means. I think people that are calling it a robbery don't really know what a robbery is in terms of MMA. But to me, I think that the big takeaway also from this fight is that if the UFC stay true to their word and make the fights that people want to see, they need to make the rematch next. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here. People see that the Texas Commission's judges were terrible all night. So who's to say that they weren't terrible in that main event? Who's to say that, if you polled every MMA fan that watched that fight, or, everybody that watched that fight that knows what they're talking about, what percentage do you think would have said Dominick Reyes won the first three rounds? I think you're talking 60 to 70% of the people. Yeah. So if that's the public perception, and the UFC purports to always book the fight that the people want to see, then book the fight that people want to see. I think that the Jones rematch should be next. I think that Jones should stick around at light heavyweight. I don't think there's, people talk about heavyweight for Jon Jones. Put yourself in Jon Jones's shoes. what's the upside of moving to heavyweight? People already consider him the best ever. He's going to have to face these behemoths that he's not used to facing. You talk about size being an issue for him. Look at the height of a lot of these guys that he's beaten at light heavyweight. They're much shorter than he is, much stockier than he is. He's not going to get that at heavyweight. So I think that we have to keep that all in mind when it comes to Jon Jones and his future. But to me, that Reyes rematch has to be next.
Yeah, you mentioned the heavyweight, and I talked about this on the last show a little bit. I wanted him to stay at 205 even before this Dominick Reyes fight. And, people were trying to hype it up by saying, oh, what about Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones? But I'm pretty sure at this point you could sell Francis Ngannou against just about anybody. You could bring out a horse out there and people would be hyped to watch it. So I don't agree with that argument. But like you mentioned, the height and everything. I mentioned Francis, 6'4". Ben Rothwell's throwing a name out there, 6'4" as well. I mean, these guys are big. And if you struggle with size, then you're going to find out real quick just how big these guys are. Dominick Reyes, he hits hard. We saw it on Jones. Thought he took the shots well. Usually when guys are starting to decline, especially physically, they have trouble taking those shots. And Jon Jones has great defense. Took a really big uppercut. We saw him take it well. My question for him at this point is, what's his mentality? With Anthony Smith and Thiago Santos, people are saying, oh, he's not motivated. He's not taking these guys seriously. Maybe considering their time at 185, I could understand it. But for me, if you're not going to take Dominick Reyes seriously, and we saw what he was doing to guys, then who are you going to take seriously at this point? So I have big questions on his mentality at this point. And you mentioned the creativity. It does feel like it's been different for him. And, there's a lot of people making arguments about USADA and stuff, whether they have a point or not. But part of that is because we feel like we're watching a different Jon Jones since he made that big comeback.
Well, I think that the saying that he, didn't get up for this fight, for example, or didn't take Dominick Reyes seriously, I think that that's wrong. I think he did take Dominick Reyes seriously. I just think Dominick Reyes is that good. I think that Dominick Reyes, he basically threw the kitchen sink at Jon early, and he won those early rounds. Then he ran out of steam. I think that's all there is to it. I think that if you watch Jones versus Gustafsson, that comeback fight, like he looked phenomenal against Gustafsson in that fight. The Smith and the Santos fight, I can understand him not getting up for those. Those are middleweights. No disrespect to those guys because Anthony Smith is a killer. And Anthony Smith, I think, can beat most of the guys in the light heavyweight division. Maheta's a great fighter too, and he was knocking guys out left and right, including Anthony Smith. So, of course, that was before they both moved up to light heavyweight. But regardless of that, like Reyes, I just think is a better fighter than those guys. And I think that Jon Jones was taking it seriously. Jon Jones was working really hard to get up for this fight. He was building beef between them. He wanted to get emotionally invested, and I think he was. And I think he did that. It was smart that he did that because Dominick Reyes is that good. And I think that if there is a rematch, that will answer some major questions regarding Jon Jones. Because if Jon Jones can't get up for a rematch against the guy that almost beat him, I don't know what he's going to get up for. But Reyes looks like the real deal, man. And I think that rematch is one to make, and I'd like to see it right away, like I mentioned.